Welcome to another Blind Abilities podcast. On today's show, we talk about technology. Technology that we use today.
We just have this device that has actually made a lot of technology obsolete.
And the technology that we use throughout our blindness journeys.
I started off with a lot of magnifiers, zoom text, Kurzweil. I had something called the Geordie.
My first technology was in the form of magnifying glasses.
I did the Kurzweil thing, and that was really interesting to have a scanner read to you. And I was very impressed. And then, you had the JAWS in the box. There's a man's voice in there.
I think the technology that we experience relates to the time and the age in which our blindness occurred. So I'm the old guy.
In my college dorm room, I had a guide dog at the time, and it was me and the dog and all this technology. I didn't have a roommate because they would have had nowhere to sleep.
We'll also be offering a couple of suggestions for what you can do with old, unused, adaptive equipment that may be gathering dust in your drawers, your attics, or your closets.
You start to wonder what happens to all that equipment. You just keep moving on through your journey and things fall aside. We have a nonprofit called iLink, and that's EYE-LINK.org. They repurpose the equipment and get them out to seniors that don't qualify to receive services from our state agencies.
I've had the ability to connect with an organization in my area called Easter Seals. They're at eastersealscrossroads.org. They do something very similar where they take in old PCs, old CCTVs, and devices and magnifiers. They have a donation where they give them out to seniors or people that don't qualify for things like that, or even people that are just starting their blindness journey and they're like, where do I even go? And it's like, oh, you can use this.
Joining us on our podcast today, Derek Daniel, host of the Life After Sight Loss podcast.
I give tips and advice. We talk about emotional support and relationships and technology and a lot of other things. I try to encourage people that, as I always say on the podcast, that sight loss isn't the end, it's just the beginning.
And now please join Derek Daniel, Jeff Thompson, and myself as we discuss technology, old and new.
Welcome to Blind Abilities. I'm Jeff Thompson.
And I'm Pete Lane. On our podcast today, we're going to be talking about technology that we've used over the course of our sight loss journeys and technology that we're using today. We're also going to be speaking about surplus technology, surplus adaptive equipment that we've used over the years but no longer use and may be gathering dust in our closets, our drawers, or in our attics. With us for our discussion this morning is Derek Daniel. Derek is the host of his own podcast called Life After Sight Loss Radio. You can find his podcast at lifeaftersightloss.com and over on YouTube. So, without further ado, let me introduce Derek. Good morning, Derek. Welcome to Blind Abilities.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me today.
Welcome, Derek.
Welcome aboard. So, Derek, tell us a little bit about the podcast and where you might find it.
Well, the podcast, again, is called Life After Sight Loss Radio, and it's basically one that I try to gear towards people who are going through the transition of sight loss. Maybe they've just recently lost their sight, either to medical issue or, accident or whatever. And I try to encourage people that, as I always say on the podcast, that sight loss isn't the end, it's just the beginning. So I give tips and advice. We talk about emotional support and relationships and technology and a lot of other things. So it's a lot of fun. It comes out every week. And if you want to find more information about it, you can visit lifeaftersightloss.com/podcast, and that'll give you all the episodes that I've released so far.
That's great. And you have over there on YouTube, you got a good bunch of videos there.
Yeah, I do a YouTube channel as well. It's sort of shorter form content where the podcast is a little longer form, but that way too I can do demos, voiceover demos, things of that nature. And you can find that at lifeaftersightloss.com/YouTube if you want to subscribe to the channel.
That's great. I was just listening to the one where you talked about outdoor activities and another one where you were in front of that waterfall or behind it. I can't tell which way you were, but it was really good how you described how audio can paint the picture that you're missing when you can't see it.
Behind me, there is a fountain behind my house, and it's got a really specific sound. Maybe I'll turn up the sound and let you hear it for just a minute.
We recently moved and I was standing in front of, I don't know if it's a lake, but it's a big pond behind our house, and they have a fountain that they put into the water, and I don't know exactly what it looks like, but I kind of have this mental picture because of the audio that it puts out, the way the water hits and the pressure and that sort of thing. So it's a lot of fun to kind of figure that out. It's kind of like putting a puzzle together in my brain.
And the videos are well done. I listened to most of them over there, actually. I particularly like your VO 101 series with some quick voiceover tips for blind and visually impaired users. Good stuff.
Thanks. I appreciate it. It's a lot of fun to do that.
Yeah, and that's what Pete and I have been doing with Blind Abilities. We always go from a position where there's people new to blindness all the time, and we want something for them because through our experience, we know that when it first happens, we are not the brightest people on blindness when you first get introduced to this world of blindness, and we wanted to have a resource. So I'm glad that you're doing it as well and that people have places to go for this.
Yeah, and I was talking to somebody just the other day, and they were asking about what is a good cell phone for, somebody who's visually impaired. And we were talking about the options, and they said, well, how can they use the iPhone? Is it voice activated? And my thought was, well, it has voiceover. And it just hit me that there are lots of people always coming sort of into the realm of blindness where it's, the technology and things like that. So it's a great time to do those voiceover 101 kind of things and your iPhone 101 series and so forth. So people are always learning new things. And I actually learn a lot of new things, even though I've been blind for quite a few years now. So it's a lot of fun to meet those people and make those connections.
Well, once again, definitely go on over to YouTube and check out Life After Sight Loss. Some very high energy videos. Derek does an outstanding job over there. Well, now let's go ahead and get started on our topic for the day. Topic is technology. Derek, tell us about the technology that you've experienced throughout your sight loss journey. And I think as such, we need to talk about the type and the nature of your visual impairment, when it occurred, and how it affected you throughout that time.
Sure. So I lost my sight back in 2001, and I have a genetic disease called Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy, or LHON for short. It's basically where the optic nerve is damaged for some reason. And when I was 18, that's when I lost my sight. My optic nerve swelled. I lost my sight in about 6 weeks, and here I am. So I don't have any central vision. I do have partial peripheral vision, so I have some limited vision remaining. So when I lost my sight, I didn't know any other visually impaired people. There was one other gentleman in my small town, and he had, I think, macular degeneration, and he was, older than I was. So a lot of this was just learning how to do the everyday things I wanted to do, being a teenager and just sort of starting my life. So I ended up getting a lot of technology at the time from, organizations, because I was going to school and so forth. And I can remember I was thinking about it this morning. All the technology I had was massive. It was such big technology. It was like a big TV and a big monitor and a printer and a scanner. And in my college dorm room, I had a guide dog at the time, and it was me and the dog and all this technology. And I didn't have a roommate because they would have had nowhere to sleep. So I started off with, a lot of magnifiers, zoom text, Kurzweil. I had something called the Geordie, which I'm sure you guys have heard of.
We'll take a look at the Geordie glasses here. It consists of two parts. There's the headset and then the control panel. The headset reminds me very much of like night vision goggles. You wear them over the top of your head. The spot for your nose goes right there. Then you have the camera that protrudes out here.
And I used it predominantly as a CCTV and connected it to my 27-inch television. So I started off in that realm with all this kind of stuff, and it was all kind of just boom, here you go, use all this, and starting to figure it out. So technology was such a blessing to use, but it was just a lot coming at me at once when I first lost my sight.
Yeah, Derek, and you said you went blind or you lost your vision around 2001. So you had the benefit of some fairly modern technology. I, on the other hand, born back in the 1950s, was diagnosed in early childhood at the age of 8 with macular degeneration, which, was still somewhat common at the time for seniors, but at age 8, it was a rare eye disease, a retinal deterioration. My first technology was in the form of magnifying glasses. I used handheld magnifiers magnifiers, which were fairly rudimentary back there in the 50s and 60s when I was going through school. And I found an optometrist in New York City named William Feinblum, and he designed these special magnifying glasses that I wore. And man, you talk about Coke bottle glasses, they were absolutely Coke bottle glasses. I had a pair of glasses that went up to, I think, about a 24x magnification level, and they had to be an inch to an inch and a quarter thick. And I got a sore neck wearing them, and I'd put my nose on the page and come up with ink on the tip of my nose every time I read a book or a piece of paper. So I think the technology that we experience obviously relates to the time and the age in which our blindness occurred. So I'm the old guy back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. My technology then evolved, I guess, into CCTVs, which, as you said, Derek, were bulky and huge and heavy. I had a CCTV that weighed probably 45 pounds. It did have a handle on it, but I never did trust the handle because it was so heavy. It evolved over time, and they got smaller. They became standalone. Then we saw CCTVs connecting with your computers to enlarge your computer screen, give you split screen. And of course, with that came screen enlargement software for the computer. I remember testing a beta version of ZoomText. I think it was probably in the late 70s, maybe early 80s, that was very basic, very stripped down, had no color, no contrast knobs, and didn't really appeal to me at that point. So Jeffrey, talk a little bit about your journey through sight loss and what kind of technology helped you through it.
Sure, Pete. I just want to tell you that we now call those glasses binoculars, Pete. I lost my eyesight due to Android streaks, and that was back in 96, 97 is when it first started happening, and then they did a couple surgeries. 3 months later, I left my work. I lost my central vision. They did surgeries and stuff, but, the actual prognosis was grim. So I went to state services, and I started getting access to, like, the CCTVs that you guys mentioned. And yeah, they were bulky. They really command some real estate. And then I went into the monocular, then, to check for my bus number and stuff. I could hone in on the bus, and all the little magnifiers. I just kept on moving along from 4 times, 6 times, 14 times, and that's where it stopped right there. And I did the Kurzweil thing, and that was really interesting to have a scanner read to you, and I was very impressed. And then, you had the JAWS in the box.
Leaving menus, Windows Internet Explorer, 43%. 100%. JAWS dialog. Links list dialog. Links list view. Search : 17 of 290.
The voice coming out of the box, I was so impressed. There's a man's voice in there. After a while, all my magnification, my CCTVs just started collecting dust because it was a lot easier to use VoiceOver and JAWS, and it just transcended into that. And, you start to wonder what happens to all that equipment. You just keep moving on through your journey, and things fall aside. Now today, as Derek mentioned, the bulkiness, the size of everything was just huge. And now look what we got today. A little device held in our hand. I feel like Star Trek sometimes. We just have this device that has actually made a lot of technology obsolete.
Absolutely. I'm thinking back to those early OCRs. I remember Kurzweil. I remember hearing that the original Kurzweil optical scanner was like the size of a washing machine. And I don't think I ever saw anything quite that large. But I used a device called the Reading Edge, which was Kurzweil technology. And it was, quote unquote, a portable optical scanner. And it was portable. It weighed about 25 to 30 pounds. It would fit into a backpack, a pretty heavy duty backpack with a shoulder strap. And I was able to use it at work. It was procured for me by the federal government, but it was kind of a desktop scanner. You put the page on it, it would
Welcome to the Reading Edge.
Wind up and roar. But it gave me some flexibility. I could take it to training classes within the building and meetings, and I was a lot more functional and independent in those types of settings, where in the past I was pretty much bound to my office for any technology, PC or other adaptive use. But you're right. 3-4 years ago, KNFB Reader comes out, pretty hefty price tag, and since then we see things like Seeing AI and, a half a dozen other OCR apps that all fit on a smartphone that slides right into your pocket.
Exactly. And Derek, today, what are you using that doesn't take up much real estate in the technology area?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the shrinking of the sizes of things. And actually now, if you come into my house, 10 years ago, you would have seen all this stuff sitting on a desk. Now you would be hard pressed to kind of notice the difference, because now I use, I'm an Apple person, so I use the iPhone and an iMac and an iPad and things of that nature. So most of that stuff is what I use for, accessing the world, if you will. I do have a small arm CCTV that connects to a monitor on my desk, but for the most part, it's all that mobile stuff that helps me connect with the world. And it all fits on my screen, and I can replace a magnifier or a book reader or things of that nature, because then they all just go right in there in that folder that holds all of those apps for me, and I can just pull it out of my pocket and use it when I need. So yeah, I'm definitely using all those kinds of things, and I've shifted from the bigger, bulkier type things.
Pete, you mentioned that it might be in the attic, might be in a drawer collecting dust. I have page 7, 8, and 9, and that's kind of the dungeon for the apps that I just start collecting, especially when you talk about artificial intelligence or these magnifier things that kind of a novelty type thing, or the magnification isn't that good, but I don't get rid of them. I have them. So, when I swipe over to those pages, we got Prismo, we got Prismo Go, we have all these other ones that do the OCR, but it seems like the Seeing AI, the one advantage that I really like about Seeing AI, which is an app from Microsoft, and it's free, is when you turn it on with the short text, it's automatically ready to go. You can start sifting through your mail. You don't have to fiddle around. So one of the things that you're going to notice is that when you open it up, you're going to have channels on there. It's going to start out with
short text, adjustable, Tom Hoon at Comcast, WW4BL splay legs on a stool. Oi Dave, the holes are not 4 periods.
Now that's on my computer screen, so I'm going to flick up from here.
Document, left edge not visible.
So it's looking for a document.
Left edge not visible.
Single finger swipe up again.
Product.
This is product where you get the UPC code on something. So it's looking for it, and you can hear those beeps like that. So I have a product right now and just put it in front of it, look for it, seek it out. Okay, it'll...
Processing. Duracell copper top alkaline batteries AA, 36 PK.
There you go. That instantaneous working after tapping on the app is sensational.
Yeah, it's really amazing, and they're developing it as we speak. You see updates constantly from it. I'm very pleased with that. That's on my main screen. You're right.
So when we're talking about all this transition as we move along here, it seems like nowadays technology, if it doesn't work, like the iPad gets outdated, can't be updated, it kind of gets recycled. And I've noticed that my grandkids still love those devices. They don't know what a slow machine is compared to how we look at things for productivity and stuff. So they use them, and you can put the parent guards on there a little bit. But when you were talking about the transition from low vision into where it doesn't work anymore, we have a nonprofit called iLink, and that's EYE-LINK.org. And what they do is they repurpose the equipment and get them out to seniors that don't qualify to receive services from like our state agency, State Services for the Blind, and they get those out. And I turned in, 4 CCTVs, 4 Victor Streams, Rubio, and a couple other gadgets and gadgets. And within 5 weeks, I think it was all gone. So it's great that someone else can use that.
Yeah, that's a great approach. Because I'm thinking now, in my drawer, I've got probably 2 or 3 pairs of glasses. Now, I don't know if a senior, for example, who's losing his sight to macular degeneration would find them useful. They're pretty thick, as I mentioned. They're very high-intensity magnifiers, but you never know. I could easily batch those up and ship them off to iLink and let them dust them off, maybe spruce them up a little bit, and at least search for somebody who might be able to use them. Derek, you have some old technology laying around the house?
Yeah, and like we've talked about, I've gone through quite a few things, and as things modernize, then you go to the next iteration and so forth. And so I've had quite a few different CCTV type things, from small magnifiers to the big ones on the desk. And of course, now I'm using, different things. So those kind of just get shoved to the side of the room. So I've had the ability to connect with an organization in my area called Easter Seals. They're at eastersealscrossroads.org. And they do something very similar where they take in, old PCs and they'll refurbish them. They'll take in old CCTVs and devices and magnifiers and lots of different things like that. And they'll, like you said, dust them off, clean them up. And then they have a donation where they give them out to seniors or people that don't qualify for things like that, or even people that are just starting their blindness journey. And they're like, where do I even go? And it's like, oh, you can use this. And it really helps them and is beneficial to them. So I think that's such a great and important thing, because what benefit are they sitting on on my shelf, they could be very beneficial to people who are sort of just starting their journey of sight loss.
Right.
And I think that's a great thing that we should and could do with those.
Well, with that in mind, I'd like to invite anybody listening who's aware of an organization, perhaps in your geographical area or anywhere for that matter. Why don't you shoot us an email and tell us about where the organization is, what their name is, any other contact information you might have, and send us an email at info@blindabilities.com. We'll be happy to gather these up and maybe post them on our website for future reference.
One of the big things that I think is important to remember is, as we all remember, when that sight loss first came to us, it's the things that fell away, the stuff like glancing at a magazine or something, or playing checkers or whatever it is that you were doing, operating your mixer. But if there's a little device that gives you a peek back at what you had, it seems like you're so readily able to grab that. I mean, you can go get training for 9 months or 6 months through programs and stuff like that, but when someone handed me that first viewer, bang, I could read a business card. Bang, I could check out what button this is. And, then I move on. It seems like I can move forward. And so I think with these people that are receiving these items, you got to remember where you were at that time when all of a sudden you first received an item that just helped you bridge the gap between when you were sighted to now accepting your blindness.
Excellent point. Derek, your podcast focuses more on the process, the sight loss journey. Of course, the title of your podcast is Life After Sight Loss Radio, so it's clearly that you're focusing on the impact of sight loss on your listeners, but you seem to focus on not just the technological and the day-to-day routines that are affected by sight loss, but the emotional impact as well. Talk a little bit about your approach and why you chose it.
Sure. So when I initially started putting videos on YouTube, that's how I kind of got started. And I found that the videos where I was talking about more of the emotional connection, the emotions we deal with, the relationships we have and how they're affected, those were the ones that got the most traction or the most comments. And so I am a counselor coach by trade, and I thought, maybe I can use this for my own personal journey to talk about this with people, because it's not that there's not comments out there about it, or like you said, training and so forth. But for the most part, a lot of it was how to use your smartphone and things of that nature, which is great. And I think there are so many use cases for that. But I wanted to talk from my own personal journey and say, here's some of the things that I faced. I also talk a lot about, or at least I try to, about the sighted supporters in our lives. And that's sort of what I deem, the spouses and friends and people whose lives are affected by your sight loss. I know that my wife and I started dating when we were 15. So she's been with me, post sight loss, pre, post, during, all that sort of thing. And it's just been a journey for both of us, how both of our lives have changed. And so I thought that my, training, my expertise, that area, I thought I could be beneficial to people. I love talking technology. It's one of my passions. I enjoy it. But I find that so many people might know how to use voiceover like a champ, yet they're struggling with the idea of grief and loss and how to deal with relationships and so forth. So I thought I would approach it from that angle as well. And I've heard from so many people not only about the tech part, but so much so about the emotions, about the way they're struggling or dealing or coping or not coping or whatever it might be. And it's just been real eye-opening to them and helpful. So that's sort of the approach I take. And it's been so beneficial, not only for the people that I've heard from, but for me as well.
That's a great point because, my kids grew up mostly thinking of me as being a blind person. I mean, I taught them English by reading the mail. I joke about that, but it's just kind of unique. You sit your kid down, okay, let's work on our English today. Who's this from? They are affected because when we're shopping, they helped do this. So they're burdened a little bit by it. But when I did buy the car when they turned 15, 16 years old, they loved it because now they got the drive. There's so many different things of how the blindness that I have affects them and the family members and the friends. And Derek, you talked about that a little bit in your last podcast, Life After Sight Loss, where it's time for you to get your backbone to engage the people who you want help from.
Yeah, definitely, because I have found that people say and have asked me questions, how do I tell my mom and dad? How do I tell my boyfriend, girlfriend? How do I let them know what I need? And they're either trying to be helpful or they're not very helpful or whatever. And the first thing I always tell people is, well, you need to know what you need and the help you need, so you're not just out there guessing. And then people do the grab and drag because they're trying to be helpful, but they don't know how. And it's like, stand up. It's like, hey, I want to be independent in this moment. I want to try to do this. And even if it's something where you need help, then you can say, hey, I need help with this specific thing. And I have found that that is so beneficial for not only the visually impaired person to get the help, but it helps the relationship, because then the sighted supporter can say, oh, I know what to do. I feel helpful in this situation, and I'm not just over here going, well, what do I do? And so then it helps the relationship as well. So it can be a little challenging, a little tricky, but it is a process, and we're on the journey together, and I think it's important to do that.
Once again, we're speaking with Derek Daniel. Derek, why don't you tell us where folks can find your podcast, your website, and your YouTube channel?
Sure, be happy to. So you can go to lifeaftersightloss.com, and if you dictate it, make sure that you be aware that it will spell it SITE, and that's taken me to the wrong website many times. But lifeaftersightloss.com, and you can find the podcast, the YouTube videos, all right there in that sort of central hub. If you go to lifeaftersightloss.com/podcast, that'll list all the episodes I have released up to this point. I think I just released episode 54, so having a good time doing that. And then if you go to lifeaftersightloss.com/YouTube, that will take you directly to my YouTube channel, where you can subscribe, watch all of the videos, and find that information there. So yeah, just go to lifeaftersightloss.com, and that'll give you all the things you need to know.
And I would say you don't need your cup of coffee before you go to any of those locations, because Derek is a high-energy presenter and very dynamic YouTube presenter and podcast host. So I applaud you on that, Derek. Very, very easy listening, and it kind of gets you motivated and inspired when you listen. And well-produced as well. I've got to give you that.
Well, thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate it.
So, Derek, thanks for joining us here on Blind Abilities. Do you have any other messages you'd like to leave with the audience?
Well, I just want to say thank you for having me on here, and it's a beautiful thing where all of us in the blindness community are working together, and it helps me to remember, and hopefully the audience as well, that we're not alone. If you're just starting this sight loss journey, there's lots of people out here that are on that journey as well, whether they just started or they've been on it a long time. We're not alone, and we are doing this together.
I agree. Learning together is a great thing, and especially sharing what you've experienced, because experience is best teacher. And when you can disseminate that down to people who are on this path, carving out their new path, it's just so nice that we can leave some breadcrumbs for them too.
Well said, both of you. Jeffrey, why don't you tell our listeners where they can find our podcast?
Will do. You can find the Blind Abilities podcast on the website at www.blindabilities.com, on Twitter at Blind Abilities, and you can download the Blind Abilities app from the App Store. That's 2 words, Blind Abilities. And now you can also, I don't want to trigger anybody's Amazon device, but you can say the A lady, the code word, activate the Blind Abilities skill, and then just ask it something like, tell Blind Abilities, play the next podcast, or play episode 300, or stuff like that. We'll have a little podcast giving a demonstration about that. So that's something new. And yeah, so we're glad you're here listening. Derek, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. It's been great talking to you and great listening to your productions over there on Life After Sight Loss and the videos. Great stuff, Derek.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate being here today.
Our pleasure, Derek. Good talking to you. Thank you very much. And that's it for today. We want to thank you all for listening, and have a great day. This concludes our discussion of technology, old and new. We'd like to thank Derek Daniel for joining us on the podcast. Be sure to look out for his podcast at www.lifeaftersightloss.com. And if you'd like to hear more of our podcasts from a blindness perspective, check us out at www.blindabilities.com. We're on Twitter and we're on Facebook. And download our free app in the App Store or in the Google Play Store. We'd like to thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.
When we share
what we see through each other's eyes,
we can then begin to bridge the gap
between the limited expectations and the realities
of blind abilities. The realities of blind abilities.
For more podcasts with a blindness perspective, check us out on the web at www.blindabilities.com, on Twitter at Blind Abilities. Download our app from the App Store, Blind Abilities, that's 2 words, or send us an email at info@blindabilities.com. Thanks for listening.